Today I woke up in a bit of a weird mood. Despite the fact that I'm in the Holy Land, I felt overwhelmed by a bit of sorrow, particularly relating to a few ordeals I suffered through earlier this year. I felt spiritually exhausted. But I'm in the Holy Land, the most, holy place on earth. Yet I felt bogged down by doubts and anxieties about my past and my future. But then I realized that this is exactly how Jesus' disciples must have felt. Think about it. There are countless examples of, despite being in the presence of God incarnate, Jesus' friends and disciples feeling the stresses of life's challenges just like we all do. Particularly, I realized this as we celebrated Mass at St. Peter's house, where Jesus used to live. Imagine waking up in a crummy mood and God incarnate casually walking up to you and asking, "How's your morning going?" There's something intimidating about that. This guy knows you better than you know yourself. It makes sense that the gospel stories focus on the more public and dramatic events in Christ's life, but what about the times he was just with friends? Think about the conversations that they had between destinations. Would they vent to him about their work or finances? Would they spill their hearts out about missing their spouses or families they left behind? Despite God incarnate literally being with the disciples, I'm sure they would have had days where they felt spiritually exhausted. Now, as easy as it might feel to make fun of the disciples for constantly doubting Christ and backstabbing him as seen in the Gospels, it's certainly something we're all guilty of doing. After visiting Peter's old house, we went out to the Sea of Galilee on a boat. It was quite peaceful. As I've said before, I find God in nature, and the whole horizon was just teeming with God's creation. In times like that, when things are calm, things are easy, when Jesus is multiplying food and wine and people are getting healed left and right, it's easy to cozy up to Christ and say, yeah, I'm confident in him. But the moment that beautiful Sea of Galilee gets stormy, as portrayed in the Gospel, it's so easy to lose faith. Even in our modern-day boat that we were on, if 10-foot waves started tossing us about, I'm not sure how we would have reacted. So you can imagine how terrified the apostles must have been in a rickety old boat during a storm, or when they were being thrown out of a temple or chased out of a city, or being mocked, derided, and threatened with death by the Pharisees. Even in daily life, imagine assisting Jesus with feeding thousands of people. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles a week with this guy on foot. Imagine coordinating where you're going to go the next day and where you're going to have your next meal and where you will sleep next, with the fear of being run out of town. It's easy to romanticize following Jesus when he was alive, but it was like touring with a rock star who had zero budget. Seeing the rough terrain and many miles these guys traversed in the Holy Land and hearing about the conditions they must have lived in gave me a fresh perspective of sympathy for the disciples. These people didn't shower, they didn't have bathrooms, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have trains or cars. They couldn't even Facebook stalk this self-proclaimed Messiah. They were following and trusting a cryptic guy who seemingly popped out of nowhere. They left their families for him. There were probably days when Jesus' friends and followers just didn't want to get out of bed. They must have felt spiritually exhausted. Lots of things happen to us on a daily basis that can impact our life outlooks, and by extension, our relationship with God. I know people who left the church because they couldn't cope with the death of loved ones. I know people who've left the church because they don't have the time to pray or go to Mass, or so they say. I know people who've left the church because they were mentally or physically abused and found it difficult to trust in any God, let alone any human being. Spiritual exhaustion can come from many causes. I mentioned this in my first episode, but in the last year, I ended 2 very intense romantic relationships. Particularly, there was one in which I felt like I was being forced to do so. That is draining. No matter how much I try to logic my way out of it, there's plenty of pain. A couple months ago, I was stuck in a part of the country where I knew literally nobody. I had to build my network from scratch. That was also draining. Running a company, as fun as it sounds, also very draining, particularly if someone isn't doing their job or if a difficult client mistreats us. I deal with people sometimes who curse me out over the phone for things that aren't even remotely our company's fault. draining. Moving twice in the same year, very draining. Like a bruise, these things can hurt long after their initial impact. Sometimes you unexpectedly rub against something that hits a sore spot. Returning to my alma mater after one of my breakups was particularly difficult when walking around our old favorite locations on campus, and I didn't see that coming. Now, it's very easy to become either apathetic or bitter because of these things. I know a lot of people, especially a lot of young Catholic men, who feel like the world has failed them. They feel bruised up by a culture that, quite frankly, is very antagonistic against men. Many of them respond by lashing out against the world, sometimes internally or sometimes externally, on Twitter. They are very spiritually exhausted. It's common to wake up and not want to get out of bed. It's easy to want to shut down, give up on your dreams, and go through the motions every day as a lifeless wage slave at work. It's easy to become bitter and resentful against groups of people for causing all your problems. But apathy and bitterness are not proper responses to spiritual exhaustion, because spiritual exhaustion serves a higher purpose. Looking back in hindsight at my hectic year, God rescued me from some very turbulent potential marriages. Every day at work I grow wiser as a businessman, and I get more resources to employ young Catholics and help more Catholic organizations. Shout out again to Mary Ryan and Alexa Harbor for running things while I'm gone on pilgrimage. I've made some lifelong friends since I started from scratch in my temporary home, and my appreciation for the church as a community has grown immensely. They're the ones who took me in. And very soon, I'll be a homeowner. And today, I'm in the Holy Land. So yes, I still hurt now and then from all the wacky stuff that's happened in the last year. But no, I regret nothing. I am grateful for the challenges God has sent my way. I'm grateful for the fruits they've yielded so far and will yield in the future. And I understand that the pains of the past will be alleviated on God's time, on reality's time. And often God sends us help to get through these struggles, and we should enjoy those. I mentioned a few of mine. Today we also visited the Church of the Visitation, built over the site at which Elizabeth offered encouragement to Mary after she found out she was pregnant with Jesus. One can only imagine the natural stresses that would arise after being told you're pregnant with the Son of God, especially when many in society would suspect the child was born out of wedlock. Yet Mary was ecstatic to see her relative. God gives us help and hugs to get us through tough times. He's certainly spoiled me rotten during mine. One thing I advise people to do is keep a list of prayers. Write down when you started praying for something and when that prayer was answered, even if it was done so in a very unexpected way. I've got items on my list that were over a year long, and I'll read back over them and think about how stressed I was at the time, how anxious I was, that storminess I felt throughout those time periods when I was praying. And it makes me look back and tell myself, wow, Will, you were really worried about this for over a year. At that moment, not only do I realize how useless and evil worrying is, but in hindsight, I see how suffering served a greater purpose in my life. And that is the key, purpose in suffering. And yes, I mean in suffering. Suffering cannot be suppressed. It's something natural to humans. And we know that because God incarnate himself suffered and went through spiritual exhaustion. One thing our tour guide, Steve Ray, emphasizes is Jesus' humanness. It's an aspect we don't always pay attention to. Here we have God incarnate degrading himself into a human who most likely, in Steve's words, had flies buzzing around his head all the time because of the lack of hygiene in ancient times. This is a God who assumed all aspects of humanness, even the intellectual and emotional ones, and he assumed them to the fullest. I know a lot of very good people who become elementary school teachers. They're well-intentioned, but a lot of them get burnt out within a few years. I see their demeanor and outlook change from optimism to bitterness all the time. Now imagine that, but to the millionth degree. Jesus was a spiritual Einstein teaching toddlers astrophysics, and he must have felt the frustrations and agonies associated with teacher burnout that we see today. It's obvious if you read the Bible that Jesus felt sorrow, he felt pain, he suffered, he agonized, he wept. He felt spiritual exhaustion. Today we enter Jerusalem, from which I'm filming this, where Jesus experienced some of the greatest agonies a human could possibly endure. The fact that Jesus experienced the whole gamut of pain tells us that spiritual exhaustion is natural. It is natural to feel crummy when bad things happen to you. Emotional pain is physical. It is a series of chemical reactions that can hurt you even more than a punch to the gut could. And that pain can last longer too. Jesus knew he was going to suffer. He knew he was going to die. Heck, he'd already experienced an absurd amount of criticism, mockery, skepticism, loss, remember John the Baptist, and stupidity thrown at him. Yet he smiled, he loved, he was happy through it all. On the flip side, he knew that he would be raised. He knew that everything would be okay at the end of day throughout all the pain. He had faith in his Father. Yet despite this faith, he still took time to agonize, to feel. He allowed himself to feel pain and spiritual exhaustion in the Garden of Gethsemane, where I will be in the next couple days. My point is this: to not feel pain is inhuman. To embrace pain without purpose is animalistic. But to feel pain, to embrace your cross, whilst realizing the purpose of suffering, is godly. Do not be afraid and do not be ashamed. Remember that the disciples felt scared and anxious when God incarnate was with them. Remember that God incarnate felt darkness and agony too. But let the purpose of your past sufferings remind you that you wouldn't be the person you are today if you hadn't gone through hell and back. No pain, no gain. Feel that pain whilst acknowledging its purpose. Tomorrow, I'll be exploring Jerusalem. I look forward to reporting on things from there. And as always, thank you again, Steve and Janet Ray and Footprints of God Pilgrimages, for giving me the glorious opportunity of experiencing God's grace. Talk to you guys tomorrow. God bless you.